You're about to leave the house, keys in hand, mind already racing through the day ahead. But then, a chill, a whisper of hesitation, something unexplainable telling you, wait, what if that feeling wasn't just anxiety, but a warning? Tonight's story is real. It happened to a man named Daniel Carter, a quiet, compassionate nurse who had worked countless night shifts without ever thinking twice about them. Until one week, when something changed. He didn't see wings. He didn't hear a voice. But he felt something, deep, urgent, and impossible to ignore. This is not a story about fear. It's about presence. A moment when the invisible stepped in, when a sign arrived just before tragedy, and Daniel listened. Was it fate, a guardian angel, or just a coincidence too perfect to ignore? Across the world, people have shared moments like these, angel signs before tragedy, flashes of intuition, dreams that felt too real, or a sudden change of heart that saved a life. Daniel's story begins in silence, but what follows will shake your heart awake. Before the worst happens, sometimes the universe sends a sign. If you believe in guardian angels, fate, or simply want to hear real stories of life-changing moments, subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us for today's powerful story, a quiet routine in the night shift. I keep seeing that night the way some people remember a dream they're frightened to forget. Half-lit, trembling at the edges yet sharper than anything real. The sky, above the ICU windows, was a bruised violet, as if twilight refused to let go. I had been on duty for 4 hours, long enough for the scent of antiseptic to settle in my clothes and for the rhythmic hiss of ventilators to become a dark lullaby. But each time the corridor hushed, my thoughts drifted to room 306 and to the man who wouldn't wake up. His name was Albert Reyes, a retired music teacher with a heart too weary to keep tempo. We admitted him 3 nights earlier. The moment I slipped the chart from its plastic sleeve and saw his age, 76, something tightened in my chest. He reminds me of my grandfather, I told Carla at the nurse's desk, and the words tasted strangely heavy, as if I had confessed a debt I still owed. Mr. Reyes had come to us unconscious. The physicians spoke in soft, factual tones about poor prognosis and counting hours. Yet every round, I found myself pausing at his bedside longer than protocol required. Maybe it was the faint trace of lavender cologne on his gown, so out of place amid alcohol swabs, that kept tugging at a childhood memory of Sunday afternoons and old guitar strings. Or maybe it was something else. Something I couldn't name, that insisted I listen for a pulse of hope, where the monitors only blinked flat warnings. On the 4th night, the halls were oddly still, no alarms, no doors swinging open, like a theater holding its breath before the curtain lifts. I decided to spend my break beside Albert. The room felt cooler than the ward, shadows stretching long across the linoleum. I adjusted the blanket over his chest and whispered, "You're not alone, sir," knowing he couldn't answer. That's when the lights flickered, just once. A soft stutter of electricity. Hardly worth noticing, except the moment they steadied, I caught a scent so vivid it stalled my heartbeat. Rain-soaked earth after a summer storm. The window was closed, the weather outside dry. Still the smell lingered, damp soil and distant thunder, filling the space like an unseen visitor. I stepped back, a tiny surge of fear rising, but it was laced with wonder too. Is someone here? The question formed inside me, silent, yet deafening. I checked the IV lines, the ventilator tubing, everything in place. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It curled up behind my ribs, urgent and insistent, the way a forgotten song sometimes begs to be remembered. A memory surfaced. My grandmother once said that when the air changes for no reason, it's because an angel has brushed past, carrying a message you mustn't ignore. At 17, I laughed it off. Tonight, the laugh wouldn't come. I leaned closer to Albert's ear. "If you can hear me, give me a sign of your own," I whispered, half expecting nothing, half terrified something might answer. Seconds stretched thick as honey, while machines kept their indifferent tempo. Then I saw it. A single tear sliding from the corner of his closed eye, leaving a glistening track across his temple. I froze. Tears can form. Reflexively, I knew that. Yet in that hush, the droplet felt like a spoken word. Curiosity sparked first. Was this the sign? Then tension. Why now? And beneath both, a tremor of spiritual wonder. Who made it happen? I pressed the call button. His lacrimal reflex just activated, I told the attending, masking the tremor in my voice. She noted it, nodded, and returned to her charts. Science has its own language for miracles, but I couldn't shake the conviction that time was folding in on itself. That unseen hands were pushing events toward a narrow path only Albert and I could glimpse. Minutes later, an alarm finally shattered the silence, not from 306. Down the hall, a critical patient crashed, pulling half the night staff away. I was ordered to assist, and I left Albert reluctantly, my mind torn between duty and a pull stronger than habit. The emergency dragged on longer than protocol likes to admit. When I returned, dawn had begun to bleed pale gold into the sky, and I braced for the worst. Instead, I walked into room 306 to find Albert staring at the ceiling, eyes wide, lips moving as though finishing a melody only he could hear. The monitors confirmed it. Spontaneous respiration, blood pressure climbing, heart pushing back with renewed rhythm. He looked at me, truly looked, and whispered, hoarse but alive, "Did you hear the music?" I swallowed hard. "No," I said, voice cracking, "but I felt the rain." He smiled, a fragile upturn that spoke of things neither of us could prove. Later, doctors would call his recovery unexpected but possible. Carla would tease me about guardian angel theories, and I would stand by the window where Violet had turned to soft peach, breathing in imaginary petrichor, asking the morning sky a question I still can't answer. Was it coincidence, destiny, or did an unseen messenger step between Albert Reyes and the dark hour that almost claimed him? I only know this. Whenever lavender meets the smell of rain, I feel that quiet pull, again, and I remember how a single tear and a scent that shouldn't exist rewrote the ending of one man's story. And in the silence that follows, hope flickers alive, gentle as dawn, reminding me that sometimes a whispered warning is all that stands between night and the breaking of light, an angel sign before tragedy we almost failed to hear. It was subtle at first, so delicate that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Daniel did. 3 nights before everything changed, room 306 no longer felt like the rest of the ICU. The lights were the same, dim, sterile, humming quietly overhead. The machines blinked their steady rhythm. Albert Reyes lay still, as always. And yet, there was something different. Daniel had come in for a routine check on Albert's vitals, clipboard in hand, mind already moving through tasks. But as he stepped across the threshold, a wave of warmth settled over him. Thick, quiet, and impossible to place. The thermostat read its usual number. The air conditioning hadn't faltered. And yet his skin began to prickle, a thin film of sweat rising on his neck and brow, as if the room itself were holding its breath. He paused at the edge of the bed, frowning gently. This wasn't like him. He was used to the subtle shifts of temperature in the ward, but this wasn't physical. Not really. It was more like the warmth had come through the walls, curling around his chest in silence. Then something happened. Not a sound exactly. More like a sentence. Felt, not heard. It came, like a ripple through the center of his being, tender and unmistakable. Do not leave him alone tonight. It didn't come with urgency. There was no fear, just calm. A stillness that felt as though it had been waiting patiently to be noticed. Daniel froze, unsure what to think. His eyes darted toward the machines, everything steady. Albert hadn't stirred, the room was empty. But the words, they stayed, nestled just beneath his heartbeat. Was it exhaustion, he wondered? My mind playing tricks? He hadn't been sleeping well, and there were always long stretches between shifts where time blurred at the edges. But no, this was different. This didn't feel like imagination. It felt like permission. And so he stayed. He pulled the old padded stool closer to the bed and sat down, resting his arms gently on the rail, watching the rise and fall of Albert's chest. The warmth never left. It wasn't stifling, just present, like a fire glowing far away, casting a protective circle around the room. For nearly an hour, Daniel didn't move. He didn't speak, just listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper, the kind of listening people forget how to do in the noise of life. He found himself remembering a story his mother used to tell him as a child, about a traveler who took shelter in a monastery during a storm. The monks said that sometimes angels appear not in light or music, but in stillness, in rooms that suddenly feel warm for no reason, in warnings that feel like love. Daniel didn't see anything. No figure in the corner, no flutter of wings. But when he looked at Albert, lying there so still, he whispered quietly, "I won't leave. I promise." And something, though he wouldn't call it a response, seemed to echo back. A peace that passed through the air, wrapping the two of them in quiet understanding. Later, when asked why he spent so much time in that room, Daniel wouldn't know how to explain it. How could he say that the warmth wasn't from a heater and the voice didn't come from outside? How could he describe a moment that made no sense to the body but made perfect sense to the soul? All he could say was this: "I think I was supposed to be there." And that maybe, just maybe, some angel signs before tragedy don't arrive with thunder or prophecy. Sometimes they come as a whisper inside your chest and a warmth that asks you to stay. It happened quickly, so quickly that afterward Daniel couldn't be sure how long he'd actually been asleep. The break room was dim, its silence broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock and the hum of a vending machine. Daniel had meant to sit for just a minute, close his eyes for a breath. Nothing more. But exhaustion had crept in with gentle fingers, and within moments he slipped beneath the surface of sleep, and that's when the dream came. He was walking down a hallway, not the hospital's, though it looked similar. It was wider, glowing with a soft golden light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the silence wasn't empty. It felt sacred, like the hush of a cathedral just before prayer. At the end of the hallway stood Albert, awake, standing tall and calm, with his hospital gown replaced by something simpler, clean clothes, a gentle smile, and eyes that held a strange, childlike wonder. His skin looked younger. The lines of pain were gone from his face. But what caught Daniel's breath was the light around him, like sunlight, filtered through water, warm and alive, wrapping him in gold. And behind Albert, there was a figure, tall, draped in white robes that shimmered like silk in candlelight. Daniel couldn't see the face. It was hidden, not by shadow, but by something softer, like the way we forget a melody just as we're about to hum it. Yet the presence was unmistakable. It radiated peace, deeper than anything Daniel had ever known. The figure stood perfectly still, hands folded in front, not commanding, but waiting, as if allowing Daniel to take in what he needed to see. Daniel stepped forward, his feet silent against the glowing floor, drawn toward Albert without fear. He felt no urgency, no doubt, only that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As he reached out, fingers just beginning to lift, he woke, gasping. The break room's silence returned like a wave crashing over him. His heart raced, his shirt clung to his back with sweat, but his hands were steady. There was no fear, only a strange, quiet peace that sat heavily in his chest, and tears he hadn't realized had risen. He pressed his palms against his face, whispering, "What was that?" Not expecting an answer, yet the feeling remained, like something had been placed inside him. Not a message exactly, but a knowing, a trace of something eternal brushing against the edge of his ordinary life. Daniel returned to the ICU slowly, and when he passed room 306, he paused. Albert was still there, still silent, still unmoving. And yet the room no longer felt the same. Something had shifted. He didn't tell anyone about the dream, not that night, not for weeks. It felt too sacred, too delicate to be spoken aloud. But deep down, Daniel knew. It had not been just a dream. It had been a glimpse of what waited or what watched, and maybe, just maybe, this was one of those angel signs before tragedy that doesn't come to warn you of what to avoid, but to remind you that whatever comes, you are never, ever alone. The dream lingered. Not just in Daniel's thoughts, but in the way he moved, in the way his breath caught whenever he passed room 306. It was as if the memory had soaked into his skin, and nothing in the hospital felt quite the same afterward. That afternoon, during his lunch break, Daniel felt an urge he couldn't explain. Instead of heading to the cafeteria or stepping outside for air, his feet carried him to a place he'd only passed by before, the hospital's tiny hidden chapel. It was quiet, tucked behind a corridor. Few people used. No windows, just soft lighting and the gentle scent of old wood and candle wax. It wasn't a place for ceremony, it was a place for silence. As he pushed the door open, he expected emptiness. But someone was there. An elderly woman sat in the front pew, hands folded gently on her lap, her silver hair pulled back with quiet dignity. She didn't turn at first, just stared at the altar with an expression somewhere between sorrow and serenity. Daniel paused, unsure if he should enter. But before he could step back, she turned and smiled. Not the kind of smile strangers offer. Hers felt different, like it belonged to someone who already knew why he'd come. "Sometimes," she said, her voice low and warm, "angels whisper when a soul is about to be called back." The words fell into the room like petals on still water. Daniel blinked. His heart stuttered in his chest. I'm sorry?" he asked, confused, caught off guard. But she just smiled again, eyes kind, steady. "Just stay near the light," she added softly. And then, nothing. Daniel lowered his gaze for just a breath, unsure what to say, unsure even how to feel. And when he looked up again, the pew was empty. The woman was gone. He walked quickly to the chapel door and glanced into the hallway. Silent. No footsteps, no cane, no rustle of clothes. As if she had vanished into air that hadn't even stirred. He stood there for a long moment, hands trembling slightly, his mind racing to rationalize what had just happened. A visitor, perhaps. A kind volunteer. A passing thought, even. But deep down, something inside him whispered, no. This had been something else. Her words stayed with him, like an echo behind glass. Angels whisper. Stay near the light. Back in the ICU, the world resumed its rhythm. Alarms, footsteps, clipped conversations. But for Daniel, the air had shifted once more. What were the odds that someone would say exactly that, without knowing anything? And why did her voice feel like something he'd heard before long ago, in another time or dream? He would never see her again. No one he asked had noticed her. No one else had entered the chapel during that hour. And yet, her presence lived on, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a sign to be felt. A gentle tap on the shoulder from the unseen. Was she real? Was she sent? Was it coincidence? Or was she part of something greater, reaching through the veil to remind Daniel that this wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and that when the veil between this world and the next begins to thin, angel signs before tragedy may arrive in the shape of strangers who leave no footprints, only light. That night, the hospital felt wrapped in something deeper than silence. Not the usual kind, where machines hummed and nurses whispered over charts. No, this was different, as if the walls themselves were listening, as if something unseen had settled gently over room 306, waiting. Daniel entered the room just after midnight, chart in hand, shoulders aching from the long shift, but the moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped. The air was still, too still. Even the ventilator seemed to breathe more softly, as though not to disturb the quiet. Albert lay motionless, as always. His face was pale but peaceful. Daniel moved closer, checked the IV lines, the oxygen level. Everything looked stable. But then again, appearances often hid the truth. He updated the chart, scribbling notes in practiced handwriting, and just as he was about to step, "Away," the monitor stuttered. "Beep, beep," then a pause, a flutter. Something was changing. Daniel's instincts reacted before his thoughts could catch up. He pressed the emergency button, calling for help, but even as he did, a heavy calm settled into his bones. Like part of him knew that this wasn't a moment to panic. This wasn't about medicine anymore. He moved to the side of the bed and gently placed his hand over Albert's. The old man's skin felt cooler than usual. "Hold on," Daniel whispered, leaning closer. "I'm here." The words weren't protocol. They weren't even for Albert, really. They were a prayer, soft, quiet, barely spoken. And then it happened. A vibration in the air, almost imperceptible, like the faint hum of a distant song. No one else in the room yet. No machines playing music, just a sound that wasn't sound at all, more like a feeling, a resonance in the chest, a tone of stillness. Daniel held his breath, hand still wrapped around Albert's, eyes wide. His heartbeat slower, but not from fear, from awe. It was as if the room had become a sanctuary. The monitors continued their rhythm, but Daniel no longer heard them. All he could feel was that gentle hum, like the last note of a hymn being carried away by wind. It pressed softly into the air between them, into the space between life and what comes after. It was beautiful and terrifying and deeply sacred. In that moment, he didn't feel like a nurse. He felt like a witness. To what? He couldn't say. A departure, a crossing, or perhaps a visitation. He didn't know if Albert was going to leave or return, but he knew, absolutely knew, that they were not alone, not in that room, not in that moment. And when help finally arrived and others rushed in with urgency and voices and orders, Daniel stepped back quietly, not out of duty, but reverence, because something had just passed through the space, unseen, unnamed, but real. Later, when the team asked him what had happened before they arrived, he said only this: there was a sound, a stillness, like someone else was with him. And in his heart, Daniel believed it. Because sometimes, before change arrives, before the breath shifts, before the light turns, there is a sacred silence. And in that silence, angel signs before tragedy don't always shout. Sometimes they sing. It happened in an instant, without warning, without sound. Just as the chaos of monitors and movement began to rise, just as the team prepared for the worst, the room changed again. Daniel stood frozen at Albert's side, his hand still resting gently over the old man's. The humming stillness that had filled the air moments earlier had not vanished, it had deepened. And then the light came, a narrow beam, thin as a ribbon, golden as sunrise, poured from the ceiling and fell directly onto Albert's chest. Not from a fixture, not from the window, no logical source, no shadow to explain it. It simply appeared as though something above the room had opened, just a little, and let something through. It wasn't bright in the way hospital lights are. It was alive, warm, pure, the kind of light that doesn't just touch the skin, but the soul. It shimmered faintly, casting soft waves across the walls like reflections off a still lake. Everyone in the room went silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the machines seemed quieter, their blinking lights slowing, the alarms fading into background murmur. For 10 full seconds, Daniel counted, barely aware of his own trembling hands. Time stood still, and then within that golden circle Albert stirred. His fingers twitched first. Then his chest rose, not shallow or mechanical, but deep, human, alive, a full breath, a return. Daniel gasped, stepping closer. The old man's eyelids fluttered once, then again, and opened. 2 eyes, soft and full of bewildered light, met his. Albert Reyes was awake. The heart monitor, once erratic and uncertain, now pulsed in steady rhythm. The tension in the room melted into stunned silence. A nurse whispered something under her breath. Another reached for the chart, hands shaking, but Daniel couldn't speak. He was still staring at the beam of light. And as quickly as it had come, it vanished. No flash, no flicker, just gone, leaving behind only the warmth, and Albert's eyes, still open, still searching, as if he too had seen something beyond explanation. Albert began, his voice dry, unsure. Was I dreaming? Daniel leaned down slowly, heart pounding. No, he said softly. You were coming back. Neither of them had the words. What do you call a moment when reality shifts, when something breaks through the veil, not to take, but to give? Later, some would say it must have been a reflection, a trick of light. But Daniel knew the layout of that room better than he knew his own apartment. There were no angles for sunlight, no fixtures that glowed gold. This hadn't been light from this world. This was something else, a sign not of warning, but of return. A whisper made visible, a divine breath made gold. And in that room, in that moment, Daniel understood something not taught in any textbook or training. That when a soul hovers near the edge and still has more to do, sometimes heaven sends light instead of shadow. And in the silence that follows, we're reminded, angel signs before tragedy aren't always about what's avoided. Sometimes they're about what is restored. Footsteps thundered in, doors swung open, voices rose in confusion. The medical team rushed to Albert's bedside, monitors flashing with signs they hadn't expected to see. Daniel didn't move. He stood exactly where the light had touched the floor, where, for one impossible moment, the world had felt like it was being held in sacred hands. A doctor leaned over Albert, stethoscope trembling. Another reviewed the vitals, eyes wide. How? Someone murmured. It wasn't a question for the room. It was a question for the unknown. No one answered, because there was no answer. Not the kind they were trained to give. Daniel remained silent. His mouth couldn't form words. His chest was tight with something more than relief. It was reverence. Something had passed through this place, something unseen, unmeasured, unexplainable. And yet it had been there. He looked down. Albert's hand, still resting in his, gave the faintest squeeze. Then, slowly, the old man turned his head and met Daniel's eyes. His voice was thin, almost weightless. but his words carried something eternal. "Did you hear the music?" Daniel's breath caught. The room spun for a second, not from panic but from realization. He nodded slowly. "I heard something," he whispered back. "Something beautiful." Albert smiled, just a little, the way someone does when they've returned from a place too far to describe. His eyes were full of exhaustion, but also of peace. The kind of peace people search for their entire lives and rarely find. All around them, doctors worked quickly, rechecking machines, preparing tests, discussing theories. The logical world resumed its rhythm, but within that small space between Daniel and Albert, time moved differently. The light was gone now. The shimmer, the hum, the golden warmth, all of it had vanished. But in its place was something even more powerful, a silence that felt holy. Not empty, not cold, but filled with meaning. Daniel didn't try to explain what he'd seen. Not yet. Some truths aren't meant to be spoken. They're meant to be felt. And he knew that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many shifts he worked or patients he cared for, he would never forget the way the air had changed. The way Albert had come back, not just to life, but to something deeper. Later that night, after the ward had quieted and the doctors had given their reports, Daniel sat alone outside room 306. He stared at the floor, at the space where the light had touched them, and he whispered, not to anyone around, but to whatever had been there, "Thank you." Because he knew, now without doubt, without fear, that something had been watching, something had intervened, and in a world filled with unanswered questions and unexplainable tragedies, sometimes what saves us isn't what we can measure, but what we're willing to believe. Angel signs before tragedy don't always come to stop disaster. Sometimes they come to lift us out of it. And when they do, they leave behind more than light. They leave behind faith. In the days that followed, the word echoed through the ICU like a soft refrain, miraculous. Albert Reyes was recovering, sitting up, speaking in full sentences, smiling. The same man who had been slipping away only a week before was now walking the halls with the help of a nurse, asking for tea and humming melodies from his years as a teacher. Doctors called it improbable. Nurses shook their heads in awe. Words like spontaneous reversal and unexplained stabilization filled the reports. Everyone tried to fit the moment into something that could be written down, studied, understood. But Daniel didn't need the charts. He knew this wasn't luck, this wasn't timing, this wasn't even medicine, not completely. It was a message. Something had whispered to him days before, when the air turned warm for no reason. Something had come to him in a dream lit by gold. A stranger had spoken words she could not have known. And when the room fell still and shimmered with impossible light, it wasn't just Albert who had been touched. It was him too. Daniel began taking his breaks in the chapel more often, but the old woman never returned. He searched gently, quietly, asked a few staff if they had seen her. No one had. There was no name in the visitor's log, no record of her being there at all. And though he kept watch, hoping for just one more flicker of that golden beam, it never came again. But somehow that didn't matter, because something in his heart had shifted. It was quieter now, but deeper. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for proof, only presence. He thought often of the words the woman had said, "Stay near the light." And now, wherever he walked, in hospital corridors, on city streets, beneath early morning skies, he searched not with his eyes, but with his spirit. Not every room needed a miracle. Not every life would be touched by light. But sometimes, when the moment is right and the soul is listening, something greater leans close. Daniel had come into nursing to care for bodies. He now understood he was also there to witness souls, And as he watched Albert rest one quiet afternoon, sunlight streaming gently through the window, ordinary light this time, he felt gratitude rise in his chest. Not loud, not overwhelming, just full, because he had been allowed to stand in that place, where heaven had bent low and time had paused, and a man had returned from the edge with music in his breath. No one else needed to believe it, but Daniel knew. Some signs are not meant to be proven. Some signs are meant to be received, and when you truly open your heart to them, you are never the same. That's what angel signs before tragedy do. They don't just prevent loss. They remind us that we are seen, that we are loved, and that in the quiet places, when we least expect it, the light still finds us. After everything that happened, Daniel began to do something he never thought he would. He started writing. Not essays, not reports, just a simple journal, a place for thoughts too delicate to say out loud. He kept it, tucked inside a drawer at home, its pages slowly filling with the kind of questions that don't need answers, only space. He found himself waking earlier, sometimes before the city even stirred. He didn't go to sunrise services for religion, not in the traditional sense. He went for the silence, the stillness. To sit in a wooden pew beneath soft morning light and listen, not for voices, not for visions, but for that gentle feeling in the chest that says, you're not alone. Work continued as usual. Patients came and went. Some healed, some didn't. But for Daniel, something had shifted. It wasn't louder, it was quieter, more inward. He still walked the halls with calm professionalism, still charted vitals and adjusted IVs. But now he noticed things he used to miss. The way a patient's hand twitched before waking. The way light sometimes pooled on the floor in shapes that made no sense. The way silence could feel full. He began to search, not for proof, but for presence. Subtle signs, quiet ones. A breath held too long, a dream that felt too real, a sudden warmth that had no source. And every time it happened, he'd pause, just for a moment, and whisper, "I see you." Not to the patient, not even to himself, but to something beyond. People asked him from time to time if he believed in angels. He would smile, not with certainty, but with peace. "They don't always have wings," he'd say. "Sometimes they come as a dream, a whisper, or a beam of light over a patient's heart." And every time he passed room 306, even after Albert was discharged and a new name appeared on the door, Daniel would slow his steps. Sometimes he paused, sometimes he didn't, but every time, without fail, he remembered that night, that light, that feeling that the invisible had leaned close, just long enough to be noticed. Some moments never leave you. They stay tucked inside, like a song only you can hear. Not because they made sense, but because they made meaning. And though Daniel never saw the old woman again, though the chapel returned to its usual quiet, though the golden beam never touched that room again, he knew. That story was never just about Albert. It was about listening. It was about being still enough to notice. And maybe that's what angel signs are really about. Not flashing miracles or grand gestures, but sacred moments. Moments that whisper before something shifts. Moments that invite us to pause before we fall. Moments that hold us softly in the space between fear and faith. Maybe you felt it too. A sudden hesitation before stepping out the door, a voice inside that told you to call someone right before everything changed, a dream that lingered far longer than it should. Have you ever experienced a sign like this? Do you believe it was just coincidence or something divine? What would you have done if this happened to you? Do you think angels are trying to guide us even when we don't notice? We're not here to give answers. We're here to listen with you, to create space for those quiet, beautiful moments when life whispers just in time. If this story touched your heart, don't let these signs go unnoticed. Subscribe to Saved by a Sign and stay with us to hear more real stories of faith, mystery, and the moments when life whispers just in time. Thank you for staying until the end, but remember, there are stories that aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be felt. We'll see you in the next one, if you're still listening.